Um, I don't, oh, my recording is up. You're recording, good. Well, once again, welcome everyone. I'm Eva Gosztonyi, coordinator of the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management and a school psychologist. And Martine, I'll let you introduce yourself.
I'm behavior consultant, working with Eva and Catherine, and at the board, Riverside.
And same with me. I'm also a behavior consultant, working both at Riverside and for the Center of Excellence.
Yes, and it's wonderful to have you here. Our second session, looking at the book Rest, Play, Grow. Not Rest, Play, Grow. Oh my goodness, Reclaiming Our Students, written by Hannah Beach and Tamara Stryjak. I guess I need my cue cards, don't I, ladies? So I'm going to actually put up the slides, and then that way it will orient me to what's happening. So I'm just going to share my screen here, and there we go. Oops, hang on. No, this does not want to. I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong thing. Let me just press the right thing here. Oops. Oh, what's going on here? There we go. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Just getting you used to new technology. So we are looking at Chapter 11, The Child Who is Resistant. And we're going to be going over the material. As we had mentioned in our last session, we are just basically sharing with you some of the knowledge that we have about the material that's in the book. The book is based on the work of Dr. Gordon Neufeld, and what we're doing, because we have such a large number of people there, we'd love to have a discussion, but you do have the chat box and the Q&A where you can put your questions. I'm going to be speaking for a while, and then at about 1:45, I'll minimize my screen and bring back the other two participants with me, so Martine and Catherine, and we will answer your questions and sort of, so for the next about 45 minutes, I'm just going to elaborate on the material that Hannah and Tamara have shared with us. So let me just move forward here and just talk a little bit about resistance, because we're talking about the child who is resistant. Why do these kids not want to follow us? And the thing is, we need to realize that the resistance, the idea of resistance, the desire to push back, is known. It's a phenomenon that's known. It's known, we sometimes feel that with our employer as an employee, and definitely some of us are feeling a lot of resistance right now to all the changes that are coming down from the ministry. If you've ever been trying to buy something and have had a salesperson who is a little bit pushy, I know that sometimes you've even found yourself outside the door of the store and just wondered, why am I here? I actually do want to buy something, but boy, when someone's trying to push us and make us buy something before we're ready to buy, we feel this desire to push back. We've pushed back, and we've seen that right now with some of the things that are happening around COVID and what society is telling COVID people to do for COVID. And we're seeing people who are actively doing the opposite, refusing to wear masks and so on. We can sometimes see that with our spouse. Our spouse tries to push us too much to do something. We just push right back. Don't tell me what to do, even though we love our spouse. Even with ourselves, sometimes when we push too hard, try too hard to lose weight or to improve ourselves, sometimes we find ourselves doing the opposite of what we want. And of course, if any of you that are working with children, as you well know, and especially if you have children in your home, most often in the morning, oh my goodness, the faster, if you're late in the morning and you need to get out of your house, the faster you need to go, the slower your child seems to go. And why is that? Oh my goodness, it's so frustrating. And what we need to recognize is we are talking now about an instinct called the counterwill instinct, which is actually an instinct that is wired into us to push back against the will of others. And it's a defensive reaction to perceived control and coercion. And it is an instinct. And this is something that, well, partly we've been told that our instincts that need to be fought against. They're not very good. They make us do things that we're not proud of. But we also need to realize that instincts are absolutely essential for us. I'm going to walk around a little bit about what this counterwill instinct is and what it's meant to do. But an instinct is wired very, very deeply into our brains. It's wired deeply into the part of our brain that has been around for a long time, and it's there. It's meant to be a protection, and so it's resisting. It's very much helpful to us in terms of our connection and connections and attachment. And we're not used to this now because we consider ourselves a global world. But when we were villages, when we were small communities, our children actually had to be protected against influence and direction from those that were not in the village of attachment, because in effect the child had to be protected from being told what to do by those who didn't know what they needed. And so now we're talking about a village of attachment and a parent-sanctioned village of attachment. So because the children need to know that the people who are telling them what to do are actually taking care of them and have it in their best interest. So there's this little kind of default button within children where they're designed to be impossible to manage when they're not sufficiently attached to those in charge. And any of you that have been a substitute teacher, you know that when that attachment link isn't there, that children are less disposed to listen to us. We also know, and if any of you have ever been on the other end of a situation where a parent has not supported you, you know that the child is actually resistant. And so we need to really make sure that we're bringing parents and anyone that can be seen as someone from the outside, and sometimes we call that a stranger, even though it's not meant to be a stranger, that we need to bring them onto the same side of what we call the attachment magnet. Because a child is meant to listen to the adult, to the person or persons who know the best of what they need. And they're meant to resist anyone who is outside of that circle. And so part of what we need to do when we understand that is to actually bring the parent into that circle with us, and the parent needs to bring the teacher into that circle. And so one of the first things we need to understand is attachment is about relationships and not about the role. But when we have the relationship, then this counterwill instinct is somewhat tamed. Now, sometimes we say, well, excuse me, but Eva, I have a child who's very attached to me. I have my own children that are attached to me, or my own classes that's attached to me, but sometimes why does this child resist? Well, we have to also be aware of the fact that sometimes when we give a directive to a child, they're not actually attached to us. They might be attached to someone else or to something else. They might be attached to the other students, or they might be attached to a video game. All of you know, you've had that experience when you're trying to call your child for supper and they're not coming. Well, they're maybe attached to their video game, attached to their TV show, or in the case of our children, after recess, they come back in after recess, they're all attached to each other. We want them to do something for us, and they're not yet quite ready to do that. And so one of the things, again, we need to recognize is this counterwill instinct will push against and back, resist anybody who's not in that circle. So when the children are attached to each other, which is perfectly normal, what we need to do is we need to find some way of turning the children to us. And we call this collect before we direct. And those of you that have heard some of these talks by us before know that particular their way of interacting with children, and I'll lay it out a little bit later when we talk about interventions. So when we're able to collect before we direct, now we bring the child into our circle, and now the resistance is less. And the thing about it is that counterwill can be held at bay. And so sometimes it can be that a child has been holding in their counterwill for a whole bunch of different reasons, and then it reemerges when a child's in a safe place. So if a child has been particularly obedient at school, and some of you might have this experience, and they get home, you might find all of a sudden, don't tell me what to do and don't push me around anymore. Well, they feel safe with you, and now they're basically letting it out and letting out some of that counterwill. And again, we're going to look at this because this has a lot to do in COVID times, this particular concept of the counterwill being held at bay. Now, counterwill serves a developmental purpose because counterwill is not only there to protect us against outside influence, but also to help us to prepare for separate functioning. First step in finding our own will is to resist and counter the will of others. And again, any of you that are now raising or remember raising your 2- and 3-year-old, and also your adolescent are seeing this, because as a child starts to develop a sense of themselves, and this usually happens between 2 and 3 years old, they actually have to push away the ideas, the attentions, the judgments, the expectations of other people so that they can figure out what works for them. And so this is at the 2 to 3 years old when the child decides that they're going to dress themselves the way they want to dress themselves. And when the child decides that it's nighttime out there, and you try and change their idea, but they don't want to change their idea. And sometimes they have actually a good reason for it. They saw the moon out there, so they figure it's nighttime. But the most important thing here is that as the child starts to get a sense that they can have ideas, can have their own desires, can have their own values, bit by bit, the counterwill can go down. And what often happens is there's a kind of a diminish, the counterwill goes down a lot in sort of the middle years, and then it comes back again in adolescence, because there's a huge burst again in adolescence for now stepping into the adult role. And so again, a lot of counterwill. As the emergent self, as the child starts to develop, you will often find that the counterwill will diminish. And any of you that have had the experience of your adult children coming back home and all of a sudden saying, oh no, this is the way we have to do things, and I'm always going to do things this way. And you're thinking to yourself, my goodness, I taught this to you when you were 15, but you rejected me for the last 10 years. Well, the reason is that now the child is coming back with their own ideas. And again, most of us in our emergent pedagogy that we do with our children recognize the need we have to give children space so that their ideas can come forward. Now, sadly, some children, when they're not given the ideal conditions for development, this self, this emergent self, stays very small, and therefore their counter-will stays large. And we often mistake it for having a strong will, being stubborn, being strong-minded, doing it on purpose, or trying to push our buttons, to test limits, to challenge authority, to seek power. And there is certainly an element of that, but actually what's happening here is very often these children who have a lot of counterwill in them feel really pushed around. And it's actually more of a protective mechanism, a defensive mechanism to protect themselves than it is truly a power-seeking kind of situation. And they're actually, rather than imposing their own will, they're actually resisting the will of others to kind of protect themselves. And if we go back to the former slide, we see this little tiny person here that desperately has to protect themselves. And one of the reasons, and so we know that for some children, that is an issue for them. Now, when attachment is intense, counter will actually be weak or non-existent. And if any of you remember when you first fell in love, how you were willing to do anything for the person that you fell in love with, or when you have a child that is really deeply attached to you, and in that moment of attachment, children will actually do amazing things for us. But when the attachment is weak, the counter will be strong. And when we see a lot of counter will problems with children, we know that there are significant attachment problems. I have a particular child in mind, I'll call him Charlie, who I called Mr. Counterwill, because, oh my goodness, his way of protecting himself was constantly to tell people that he wasn't going to do what they wanted them to do, and he was always resisting our will. Well, I knew that little guy's story, and he had a mom and a dad who had a lot of challenges themselves. And the dad was very upfront. He said, I'm scared to spend much time with my son because I know I have problems managing my own frustration. And so he would send his son away, but his son felt that as being rejected by his dad. And so he had a lot of counterwill, and that counterwill actually came out more at school where he felt safe. So some of the things that we need to know is that attachment is a primary need of the developing being, and children need attachment to grow and develop. And as a safe attachment figure, we care about children and love them, and we also take charge of them. And so these are important things, but one thing we need to remember is that being dependent requires the ability to tolerate vulnerability. For some children, the act of trusting someone else is very difficult, especially when they've lived a context, lived in a family where maybe the people that were supposed to take care of them weren't able to. Now, what happens here is very interesting, is that we as the teachers, as the educators, as the people that choose to be in school and choose to take care of other people's children have very strong alpha instincts. And our desire is to provide for our children, to orient, to protect, to defend, to look out for, to possess, to lead. We are all there about taking care of children. And what we hope is that the children will come to us and be willing to seek assistance, to look up, to belong, to look for guidance, to allow us to teach them, to allow us to guide them, to allow us to help them become the best that they can be. And when these two instincts, the alpha instinct and the dependent instinct, come together, it's a match made in heaven. And it's really easy for us to do our job as teachers and guiders and leaders. But for some children, when it is not safe to depend, either their parents are unpredictable or hurtful or abusive, or if a child is particularly sensitive and it makes it really difficult to let others take care of them, and then if we can think particularly of our children on the autism spectrum, then they will have to, this counterwill instinct will be there to protect them, and it will push those who are trying to take care of them away, because the brain has basically said, I'm going to take care of myself and I will not let anyone tell me what to do, because I'm the only one that knows how I can take care of myself. What ends up happening here is that as the alpha, in our providing mode, we find ourselves in the place of someone who won't depend upon us. And this is where some of the resistance that certain of our children who are particularly hard to manage comes from, is because they cannot feel, their brain has basically said, you can't trust the adults necessarily, and I'm going to take care of myself, and the counterwill instinct pushes back. So we end up with this kind of a drama. It's in 3 acts. Act 1, when kids get stuck, we start pushing. But when we start pushing, they feel pushed and they put the brakes on. And again, remember back to that morning when you had to rush your kids out the door, how slowly they went. And then the problem is when they get stuck in their resistance, we tend to get stuck in our persistence. We want to push back. And in a moment, I'm going to explain to you why that happens from inside of our brains. And so when we are, first of all, handling counterwill, first we need to recognize this instinct. Name it, recognize it, think about it where we might experience ourselves. You know, I know for myself, sometimes driving on the Metropolitan, I find my counterwill kicking in because the guy behind me wants me to go faster. Not only do I not, you know, not only I'm unhappy with him pushing me, but I have a desire to go more slowly. That's my counterwill instinct. Dr. McNamara, from her book Rest, Play, Grow, basically says that we need to truly remember the belief that resistance and opposition must be unlearned doesn't recognize or value the developmental benefits of having one's own mind. Our children, we want our children to grow into their own people. We want them to decide what they want to do. That's part of the goals and dreams that we have for a well-developing child, is a child who knows and knows what they want, makes their own decision, decides themselves to be kind, decides themselves to be someone who has values and so on. And so we have to remember that when we see opposition, it's part of this developmental process. And we also need to appreciate that for some children, their resistance comes from immaturity, but it's not going to go away if we punish them or teach a child to behave otherwise. It actually needs to come with their own growth and development. And Dr. Neufeld just gave a masterclass this weekend about a number of different things about troubled children. But one of the things he mentioned about the counterwill instinct is that actually the more mature we become, our counterwill instinct does not go away. What changes is that, first of all, as we become older and can reflect on ourselves, we recognize and accept that we all have the counterwill instinct. And secondly, then we have the prefrontal cortex that allows us to temper our counterwill instinct, to work with it. And again, all of you have known this. Perhaps you've had a brand new principal that has walked into your school and unfortunately has tried to go faster than the staff is ready to go. I'm sure that during the meeting when this principal says, oh, I have this wonderful idea, I really think our school is going to need to do this, and you're not ready to follow that principle yet, I can see the arms crossing, or inside the head people saying, you can't tell me what to do, but your maturity isn't going to actually say that out loud to that person. So we need to grow children. We need to grow them out of acting on this desire to resist. So it's not a learned response, but an emotional reaction based on instinct, and we need to work with it. But let me tell you, for those of you that have chosen to get into education, this is one of the biggest challenges you're ever going to have to face. So what's our role as the principal, educator, teacher, coach, technician, attendant, counselor? Our role is, first of all, to adjust our view, to take it less personally and realize that this is an instinct that's kicking in, to recognize that instinct and to see it. My goodness, when I finally understood about CounterWill and I saw little Charlie and I saw what happened to him, I went, oh my goodness, he just needs to figure out some way to protect himself. That's all he's doing. He's not trying to be rude. He is not trying to be oppositional. He is not trying to push our buttons. He's just trying to protect himself. And in that moment, when we recognize that, to try and do no harm, we might not be able to have the best reaction we can, but just recognize that sometimes our natural reaction, and I'll talk about that in a moment, might do more harm than good. And so we try and figure things out. Then we need to change the way that we look at it, adjust our stance. Let the kids know, and in fact, we're going to talk about this again around COVID. It's normalized to let them know that pushback is part of the process. And if we can, place the child and some of these children in charge as much as possible, and to try and make room for the child to display their own will. Ultimately, of course, when we're working with children through a developmental process, which is what Hannah and Tamara are sharing with us, is the developmental process, we need a lot of patience. And when we can have patience with these children that are very hard to be patient with, if we give them time, oh my goodness, we see huge changes. So one of the things we need to recognize is, as alphas, we have a very, very strong instinct to provide. And oh my goodness, when a child says, you can't tell me what to do, we have an enormous reaction. And one of the things we need to understand is, first of all, why we do have that reaction, and then what we can do about it. Now, just around alpha, again, very, very quickly, our brains are wired as alphas for two basic things. As an alpha, we're wired to perceive vulnerability. And all of you know this. A kid has walked into your classroom, a kid has walked into the school, a staff has walked into the classroom, and you've all of a sudden, for some reason, it crosses your mind to say, oh, I wonder what's going on with him today. Ooh, there's something going on. Because part of the alpha response is to notice fear, upset, naivety, wounds, confusion, weakness, defensiveness. We notice when things are not going right. We notice right away, and our heart goes out to that person. But we are also, as alphas, because our job is to take care of, very sensitive to when people talk back, to when the child shows a lack of respect or deference or submissions or compliance or conformity or superiority. We all know instinctively of alphas, there's something wrong with that. One of the things I have had to come to understand is that there are slightly different versions of alpha. As a school psychologist, my alpha is around perceived vulnerability. But those of you that are educators, your stronger perceived alpha is around alpha challenges. And so I got into a little bit of I would find myself into this little discussion with teachers, specifically around, the teacher would say, but he won't listen to me. And I would say, oh, but poor guy, poor Charlie, his dad. No, but Eva, he won't listen to me. Until I understood this and realized, oh my goodness, you're completely right. A child who won't listen is a child you cannot teach. So now what we have to figure out is how we work with a child who won't listen, because the natural response of an alpha for when there's a perceived alpha challenge is to immediately assert dominance. And every one of you does this, and usually with your classes it works really well with 80 to 90% of the children, even 95% of the children. When the children saying, Miss, do we have to do this? And you aren't gonna, you just look at them and you have this look, you give them the look. And that's the alpha look. That is the look. No, this is not one of the times when we're going to discuss this. This is me deciding we're going to do it. And interestingly enough, when we move into that sort of slightly dominant, slightly position, Most children go immediately into the dependent position, which is, all right, it's now the teacher's time to be in charge of the classroom. Not a problem. Of course, when our child who has this counterwill instinct when they see us moving into dominance, now they move into, you can't push me around. And this is what we classically call a power struggle. When the counterwill instinct of a child who's defending themselves meets the counterwill instinct of the person who has very strong alpha instincts. And I prefer to call it a counterwill alpha battle. Well, the problem is, as we all know, you try and push for those children around and they will push back in a number of different ways. And so now we need to move into the other two parts of our natural alpha instincts is, okay, how can I take care of this child and how can I take responsibility for this child? And when we realize that this child has a counterwill instinct that we need to take care of, we need to realize that actually we do need to go through the back door. And just one little nuance here as well, which teachers and educators recognize, is that if I let this child do whatever they want, I'm going to lose my alpha position with the other children. And when I heard that, I thought, my goodness, they're right. If I just say to that child, well, do whatever you want, because that's one way of getting out of a power struggle, just do whatever you want, you're absolutely right. The other children will say, well, who's in charge here? So one of the things that I have come to understand, and sort of a little mantra that I have now developed, I'm sure other people have as well, but how do we maintain that alpha position in the face of counterwill? And I call it, you stay in charge even if you can't be in control. Whoa, that is not easy to do. And one of the ways that you can do that is by saying, I have decided that you may. Or we might, if the whole class is fighting us, let's all. Now, I just want to tell you that I was taught this by an incredibly intuitive, incredibly alpha, incredibly wonderful teacher who was working in our NEST program with children, with kids like Charlie, who had incredible counterwill. And we had a little girl who was refusing. She had been told that she had to sit for 1 minute before she could play with some toys. In retrospect, we should never have said that to her, but we said it to her. And luckily, there weren't any other children in the class. The teacher was there, kept every trick in the book she could to say to the child, if you just sit still for 1 minute, you will be able to get your toys. And this little girl was having nothing of it. And of course, for her, the counterwill was going to move into a tantrum. I pulled the teacher aside and I said, you know, my old psychologist instincts kicking in, I said, you need to give her those toys unless you're willing to have a meltdown. Well, we weren't willing to have a meltdown with this little girl. We had seen her meltdowns before and we were not ready for that right now. And I said to the teacher, well, if you are not ready to push her into meltdown, you're going to need to give her the toys. She rolled her eyes at me like, Eva, really? So I just said, I don't know. We're at an impasse. We are at an impasse. So she nodded her head. She went over and took the toys. She picked up the toys that little girl wanted to play with. She sat down in her lovely alpha way with her shoulders back, her head high, with her very nice smile. And she said to the little girl, I have decided that you may play with the toys. Well, of course, immediately the little girl started playing with the toys. The impasse went away. I said, okay, that's how you stay in charge, even though you can't be in control. So this is something that you need to practice, and many of you will probably need to practice this at home because this does not come naturally to you. But I think it solves the problem of how you stay alpha when you are in the face of a huge counterwill. In pandemic times, oh my goodness, the counterwill can actually be kept at bay by alarm, and you've probably noticed this. Many of you were surprised at how willing the children were to do things that we needed them to do. We needed them to wash their hands. We needed them to stay 2 meters apart. We needed them to wait until we told them that they could do something. There were so many things that we needed our children to do. And I've done a survey of many schools and asked them, how's it going? Oh, it's going surprisingly well, Eva. It's going surprisingly well. Of course, the other thing is that the children were so happy to be back and they so wanted to please you guys that the counterwill was kept at bay, because they would comply to keep safe. But we do not like being told so specifically to do so many specific things. And so again, this is what I say, that it'll be kept at bay, but it will manifest itself in a situation where safety is not an issue. And again, I had one of the educators, I don't exactly remember what her role was, but she said, you know, Eva, we've got the kids in the classroom now. They're very compliant with all the other rules. We get them into the classroom and they don't seem to want to work. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is an example of CounterWill being kept at bay. Because when there are too many have-tos, there is going to be pushback somewhere. And of course, what are they going to do? Well, maybe they're not going to do the work. I'm not doing any of this stupid work, outline refusal. Or they're going to do the work, but not do it the way we want them to. Or they might do the opposite of what we want them to do. Or they just might seem unmotivated. And so when I named this for her, she said this was really helpful. And then I gave her some of the suggestions that I'm going to give you in a moment for dealing with CounterWill. And she also came back to me and said that also was very helpful. The other thing we need to realize is that when there are certain things that make a child feel vulnerable, and when that happens, we're going to get more CounterWill. When we introduce new learning, our oppositional children, when the teacher says, oh my goodness, we're going to do such and such, and it's so exciting, and all the other kids are going, oh wow, that's so exciting, oh, it's stupid. That's CounterWill. Or when the child doesn't know what's expected. So we tell them to do something and, well, I don't know how to do this. This is stupid. Or if they're going to made to be look inadequate, especially in front of their peers, or do something that confirms their inadequacy. And by the way, we usually get most of our CounterWill when children are expected to write, because the act of writing actually displays our inadequacy in front of other people. At least with talking, you can kind of talk around it, but when you have to put it down on paper, you see it and everyone sees it, that maybe you're not as good as you thought, or the ideas you had in your head are not going down on the paper. And so there's often a lot of CounterWill actually around the writing process. We need to remember CounterWill is there. It's not very pleasant. Try not to take it personally. Anticipate it and expect the CounterWill. Reflect the resistance as natural and normal. Then repair the damage done by CounterWill. The child refuses to do something. We say we've had it with them, whatever. Then afterwards, we might need to go back. For some children, we do need to send them away. And as you all know, we don't have difficulty with sending a child away to someone, but to isolate. And I remember this kept happening to Charlie. He kept getting sent away. I remember he got sent back to the classroom because we didn't understand the whole dynamic very, very well. When he came, he was separated. He was sent out from gym class. He was put into the classroom and the teacher felt she had to ignore him. He just got worse, right? Once he was sent away, when he came to the classroom, we needed to work on CounterWill and work on it and help him understand that it was okay with, and we were going to help him around it. Try not to make the behavior the bottom line, and then repair the damage. So our three-pronged approach, understanding that CounterWill is a response to coercion. Is there some way that we can enhance the child's sense of development and emergence? And can we enhance attachment? So with attachment, we want to make our attachment stronger. So one of the ways we want to do it is to try and look attachable. How can we let children know that we're here to take care of them before we're going to give them a direction? How can we help the child get a sense of their own will? Well, that's by giving choices. And that's one of the things pedagogically that we're actually quite wonderful at, maybe not so much in terms of behavior. And of course, try to minimize the coercion. And some of the, again, I have learned a lot of what I'm preaching in this has been confirmed by what I saw very, very gifted teachers do. And some teachers, I noticed that when they're having a hard time getting children to do what they want them to do, they actually spoke more softly. And I didn't understand why, but now, of course, that means that we're taking the coercion out of our voice. So we need to, when we have this feeling, when a child is not wanting to follow us, we actually have to do the opposite of what our alpha instincts are telling us to do, which is basically letting them know who's in charge. Now we need to take some other steps. Back off until you get a better attachment hold. Try and draw the attention away from the coercive elements of the situation. It's very tempting when a child is not following our directions to stand there and wait until they do it. But actually, we need to give time and space for the counter-will instincts to diminish. You know, I'm sure all of you have perhaps said to your spouse, "Stop! Just don't force. Just don't push me around. I'll do it when I'm ready to do it." And That's sometimes what the child, if they're not saying it out loud, that's what they need. So it's hard for us because we know that perhaps if we turn our back, they won't do what we want them to do. But we've actually, all of us, Martine, Catherine, and I have all had the experience as well, that when we back off and back away, that actually some of the children will start the writing, start the reading, start the activity, but they just need that little bit of time to kind of tame that counterwill instinct. And of course, some of the other children will immediately walk away and they mean, he's not doing his work, miss, he's not doing his work, miss. And of course, now you're standing there thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to get back my alpha position? Because the kids are thinking, I'm letting him get away with this. And of course, again, most of you are masters at this, of basically saying to the children, don't you worry about it. I'm dealing with this. Now, why don't you pay attention to your own work? And that is exactly how we manage the alpha stance. All the other children want to know is, Miss or Sir, are you aware of what's going on here? Are you in charge of this? And when we turn to them and say, don't worry, I'm handling it, most of them just relax and away they go. So we sometimes have to refrain from using that commanding tone, focusing too much on the shoulds and the have-tos, focusing on trying to do it. And then also we need to lead the child out of the impasse of the power struggle. Come alongside that counter will. Oh, you really don't want to do this right now. It's okay, I'm going to give you a moment, and we walk away. So because some children, and I know that, you know, that I've seen some children, the counter will instinct comes up and I can just see on their face, the no comes out of their mouth and then they're disappointed in themselves. And we just need to come alongside that if we understand that they have a lot of counterwill. And believe me, my poor little Charlie got himself into so much trouble. You know, again, if any of you have ever, you know, if you remember back to raising 2-year-olds, you can play with this counterwill. You know, you can even get a 2-year-old to say they don't want ice cream, you know. So the impasse is there. It's not always, it really is that instinct. And so we want to just help them get out of this dreadful situation that they sometimes find themselves in. And sometimes we even need to say, you know what, it is better that you do something else. I'm not doing this stupid math. You know what, it is better if you do something else right now. Look for something else in your basket. The other way, of course, that we can reduce coercion is have structures and routines to orchestrate behavior. The routine guides the behavior, they teach in a fun way, and of course we try and make those routines as engaging as possible. I'm sure many of you have found 100 different ways of getting the children to walk from one place to another with the 2 meters of distance, right? So we're going to hop like a bunny, quiet as a mouse, big steps like a giant, superhero job, and so on. And of course, we have found ways within our schools of having the environment speak to what the children need to do. So we put the masking tape and the signs on the floor, the 1-arm length, the hula hoops, anything that we could do so that we don't have to keep telling the children or reminding the children to keep their distance. With the seating, the desks were spaced out, the masking tape was on the floor. We told children, this is your island. Now we didn't have to tell it anymore. Hopefully the visuals told it. With the walking in line, again, hula hoops or using a rope, all different ways that we can help children to figure out what to do without us having to tell them that. And of course, with circle time, sitting in the hoops, and all of you have seen what some cities have done now in parks, where they just drew circles on the grass so that people knew how far to sit from each other. It's not 100%, it's not guaranteed, but it's a whole lot. It protects the relationship so that we aren't being the ones that are ordering children around all the time. And that then allows us the opportunity to provide the directions that we need to do to keep them safe. Of course, what we want is the child to be in that dependent relationship with us, and so we have to actively engage the attachment instincts. We need to get into their space or into their space in a friendly way, collecting the eyes, the smile, and a nod. One of the things, I have this little joke about Eva's teacher education school, and to get into my teacher education school, you have to actually pass Drama 101. Because one of the things that happens to some of our children, including my poor little Charlie, who also had ADHD, and so he didn't always notice when people were calling his name, is that very often these children, you know, when we're trying to get the class together, we go, children, you know, and you go 1, 2, 3, look at me, and the other children go, you know, whatever, 3, 4, 5, look at you, or whatever they do. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at these things. They look up and they see our smiling face, and then we're nodding and smiling. Okay, children, now you need to do such and such. Well, poor old Charlie is in his little world of his own, and so then we go, Charlie, 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 and our face is getting more and more frustrated. And poor old Charlie looks up and you're calling my name. And he looks up, and what he needs to see is a smile at that moment. Eyes, a nod, and a smile. And so sometimes we need to fake this or put it on our face, because if we can get him to smile, oh, Charlie, I'm so glad you looked at me. My goodness, you were so busy. Oh, I just have such, and then we get a little nod and a smile, and away they go. We, give them a little something. Oh, I know you really love playing with Lego. Oh my goodness, thank you for looking at me. Here, let me help you. I know we can't help him put the Lego away, but here, let me help you. And let me show you this is what I'd like you to do right now. So we have this attachable way of looking. We call this collect before we direct, space, eyes, smile, a little nod, and in that engages the attachment instincts, and children will automatically want to follow us. One of the things we need to remember, though, is that with very young children, with children that are very immature, they can actually fall out of attachment very quickly. So you need, when they're nodding and smiling, is when you need to give them direction, because I remember in our NEST class, the teacher had this going on just before recess was over. The little guy hated going in for recess, but he was nodding and smiling and promising her he would do anything. And in that moment, she should have gotten him to go into the school, because when the bell rang, she looked up, he looked up, and by the time she looked back, the attachment had flipped around, and when she said to him, you need to go into school, he wouldn't follow her. And she said, I don't understand, Eva. He was so attached to me. He was attached to you in that moment, but he fell out of attachment a moment later. Sadly, some kids fall out of attachment very, very quickly. So we need to come alongside. It's hard always to have to do things. Normalize. There are times when we don't really feel like doing it, and we need to give them the time and space. And the educator who spoke to me about those children who were really unmotivated with their schoolwork, I said, talk to them about this. Bring this up. Let them know it's hard to do that. And the kids were actually relieved, because they thought there was something wrong with them, that they were so unmotivated. And of course, with emergence, we need to provide some sense of choice, put the focus on the child choosing to do something, make room for their initiative. We had one little guy that was absolutely refusing to have anything to do with mathematics. And the teacher basically, I said to her, well, can you make up a basket of mathematical things? And if he doesn't want to follow your lesson, can you give him the option of going and getting his math basket and choosing something from the math basket? So yes, you're imposing math, but not exactly what you had in mind. So he has some choice in the matter, but at least he's doing some math stuff. And she said, yeah, that worked. And then we try and get their good intentions. I know this is going to be hard for you. I know you're not going to want, but do you think you could give it a try? And they will. And then place in charge where appropriate and where possible. And I'm going to show you how you can do that through play and playfulness. One of the things, though, that occurred to me is that sometimes we have to do things to take the mind off the have-tos. So this is why we sometimes sing with children when we need them to wash their hands enough. Get their mind off the have-to. Play a game with it. And remember, playing usually evokes smiles and increasing attachment. And when kids are smiling, they're much more willing to do what we want them to do. And I think sometimes we need to play with no. I think you should have a no dance. I think you should get your kids up and say, all right, let's say no let's dance the no dance. I'm not doing this or whatever. Or just saying no out loud, or saying I don't want to, as out loud and as silly as you can. And I think maybe if once a day we did this in our classrooms, it would kind of take a little bit of the edge off of the general resistance that we're finding right now. These are just some ways that people have found playing with taking your dog for a walk. If you have a child who's somewhat resistant in your class, oh, we're going to play at being airplanes. We need to separate them again. Can you show us how big a Boeing is, a 747 is? Or could you lead us in one of these kind of dances? I call them TikTok dances, but I know nothing about TikTok, so I don't know. But you know what, or let's pretend to fish. So we find ways of getting kids to do what we need them to do in a playful way. Again, just very quickly, and most of you know this, but with some of our children, and especially now in COVID times, the have to with a clear agenda can actually provoke the resistance. So when we name, we're going to make tulips, maybe we want to do it in another way. I've gathered some supplies, and what kind of spring thing do you want to do? You need now to do your math, to do your book report, get it done. Sometimes we need to say, well, this is our mission, book reports, math, let's see what you can do. Do you think you can do it on the erase board? Do you want to show us, show me something about your book report, draw me a picture about your book report, I'll come and help. So we, again, diminish some of the coercive elements. And of course, again, and most of you are very, very good at this, we no longer tell children we're writing about cars and language arts. We're giving them all sorts of different options of different ways in which they can write about cars. Again, we need to be a little bit sensitive about this. I know most of you are down to the last week in school, so you just kind of want to get through it. But again, these are just little ways in which we can make sure that we're not inadvertently triggering the COUNTERWILL instinct. And finally, provide journals, sketchbooks, magazines, a creation station, give some downtime between recess and so on. All of these things are things that we can get kids to do so that the COUNTERWILL instinct is less, and then of course we need to direct. Ultimately, as Dr. Neufeld tells us, managing resistance is a matter of right relationships and melting the heart of the child who feels they have to protect themselves. And I will stop sharing my screen and bring back Catherine and Martine and just see how we're doing in terms of questions and comments.
So we do have a couple questions. First one from Mike says, how does one approach First Nations students with this theory? Knowing and understanding our realities is important to put into practice this approach.
Well, thank you very much for your question, Mike. I think again, I think I would appeal to our general humanity. An Indigenous child is a First Nations child, has exactly the same basic instincts as we all do, a very normal instinct. And I think, again, I'm not familiar with your particular community, but I think, interestingly enough, many of the Indigenous ways of teaching children actually did everything that they could to allow the will of the child to be manifest. I think there were a lot of letting children practice things and do things and imitate before we requested them or required them to do it in a certain way. I'm sure as children matured, the demands got stronger, but when children were little, I think there were less demands. When we brought children into schools, we've changed that dynamic a bit. And so, of course, that's made it, just kind of, cultures had their way of working with these instincts without actually talking about them. And I'm sure you and I could have a very interesting discussion about natural ways of teaching and learning that worked through the COUNTERWILL instinct.
Another question is, how do they know you're smiling when you're wearing a mask? And so in the situation of COVID.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's where the old eyes need to speak. That's where you need to watch your body language. I mean, again, our natural instinct is to want to, because we're trying so hard to communicate, sometimes we don't even notice that we're holding our body quite tensely because we're not used to it either, and we need to very much lower our shoulders. As our shoulders lower, our brow becomes smoother and our eyes become a little bit easier to see. But these are huge challenges that we're facing in these COVID times. The things that we naturally, I was actually trying to find a picture. I think, Catherine, maybe it was last time, we were trying to find a picture of an intervention of a teacher intervening with a child when they were, not completely beside the child or touching the child was nearly impossible. So yes, this requires a lot more consciousness of our communication, our nonverbal communication.
And I would add, Eva, I mean, anything that is similar to a smile that isn't a smile, the tone in her voice, having the heart sign, the thumbs up sign, a wink, I mean, anything that can show warmth. It doesn't need to be a smile. I actually heard, I saw this online somewhere where they were creating masks, especially for the little ones, where there was, it was sewn on, it was a plastic covering so you could actually see the mouth. And this, it was, and also for those who cannot
hearing impaired and read lips.
Exactly.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah. It's quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think they could be recommended, especially at the lower grades.
Yeah, for
it
sure.
might be less alarming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think tone of voice is the big one. Tone of voice, the stance. If we're walking towards them, at what rate we're walking towards them, just our whole stance. Are the hands out and open, or are we kind of like, coming with intensity?
There was a question from Nicole, would love more information about the limits. It was so interesting to me that children did the tapping of the pen because it was their way of focusing. Any information on this would be wonderful. This is from the chapter that Nicole was referring to.
I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact scenario there. But yes,
I think the example, Eva, was where one of the students that Hannah mentions or Tamara mentions is their way of regulating or staying focused. You know how some will fidget with a fidget tool, but this particular student was like kind of like tapping a pen, and that was his or her way of kind of like, you know, finding, like being in a space where they would then focus and attend. But at the same time, that pen tapping can be quite unnerving and frustrating. And if you've asked the student to stop and then it just gets louder and more intense and they're looking at you, then I think that's another angle. Then you see that it has gone from possibly one angle for the student, but then it got triggered. You know, the counterwill instinct gets triggered. And how can we work with that?
Yeah. Well, and again, you know, the interesting thing about this particular way of looking at kids is that you're probably going to get it wrong at least 2 or 3 or 4 times before you even start to figure out how to work with it, right? Because again, your alpha instincts are going to tell you, no, like I told you to stop that, you better stop that. Again, nothing wrong with that. That is your role as a teacher. Then now that you've understood a little bit about counterwill and you see that when you've asked the child that it actually got worse rather than better, you go, oh, okay, there's something else going on. So now you need to figure out another way of working with it. And again, sometimes pulling the child aside, you know, and talking to him about the pencil and did you notice that you do it and what can I do, and you know, and so just different kinds of things that we can, replacing the you know, the pencil with a softer one. I don't know, like
I've seen a teacher where they have the thick pipe cleaners.
Oh, okay.
And saying like, you know what, I don't know if you like the feel of your pen, but I figured this out that I love sometimes, like if I'm watching something that I will fidget with this and I like the texture, and some of them are more like a straight and others go thinner, bigger. And she would say, hey, so I thought of you and I brought these for you. So if you want to try them, you're welcome to have them. But that thinking of them, like you're priming the connection, I thought of you, I thought you might be interested. Hey, do you want to try this out? Give me some feedback. So you're priming the connection, but also showing that there's an understanding of there's a need, it meets a need for you. And how can I come alongside to help that and not be pushing it in a coercive way, but coming alongside and putting out some other options, not doing a take out, but an add in of something else that can be experimented, tried with.
Yep. Yep. And for many children, they're fine with that. They'll move along with it, especially because when you're not in, you know, you're pulling them away from when their counterwill instinct has been triggered to a time when when you pull them into attachment. As you say, if you say, oh, I was thinking of you and I brought something for you, again, in good intent, would you think you could try this the next time? Chances are they won't try it the next time because it's so natural to do the pencil, but you know, we work with it and we play with it. And again, you know, we're getting so close to the end of the year this year that for many of you, there isn't time to play with these kinds of things. I recommend some of the things that we've talked about today and some of the things that Hannah and Tamara mentioned in the book is for actually to try it at home. You know, if you have children in your home, try it. You know, try the I've decided, you know, letting a child do what they want to do, but you taking the alpha stance with it. You know, just try those little nuances, those little things, and see how they work for you, and name counterwill, and you know, just play with it. And you know, again, it's, I think, possibly a little bit easier when you don't have quite as many children to do with it, and then it starts to become a habit. It starts to become a way of seeing
it. At home could be around asking your child to clean their room, and often they don't want to. And the I've decided can be very easy in the sense of, you know what, I've decided that any time today would be good.
Yeah.
So if by bedtime this could be done, that would just be pretty wonderful. Instead of saying, can you clean this now? And stopping them in what they're doing. And you know, like I love a surprise. So let me know.
Yeah.
And often they will fall into step more easily because then they decide the when, the how, and you know.
Yeah.
But even if we talk about, you know, I don't like cleaning this, I don't like doing the vacuuming, but I figured if I'm going to do it, I'm going to have some fun. So maybe I like to do it with some music. Well, it needs to be a little bit louder when I vacuum so I can hear it. So it's kind of like having a party, but I'm going to vacuum having a party. And if we even just model some of that, it also, it's that there isn't anything wrong. Like there's some things we need to do, we don't like to do. And yeah, they are even for adults, but how can we turn it into playful and get it done, and then kind of get that satisfaction of like, ta-da, it's finished, done for that for the week, it's off the list, woohoo. But how can we make it more playful and fun? Because I mean, there's nothing exciting about most of the household tasks, but how can you turn it into something a little bit more enjoyable, or at least the after it's done, then you've got that sense of satisfaction where mission accomplished.
Yeah, and I know, like with I remember with my own son, you know, I thought he just was refusing to clean his room. He was quite a little emotional little guy, and so it came out quite easily with him. But I remember walking in the third time, walking into his room, and he hadn't done anything yet, and I was just about to, you know, do that, like, this is it, I've had it with you, buddy, kind of a thing. And the poor little guy burst into tears. I don't even know where to start. Oh. It's much easier if you have a kid like that. You know, if you have a COUNTERWILL kid, it's like, you know. But the other one too is that, you know what, if you've decided that it's just too overwhelming, you can just say, you know what, I think I've decided to help you today. I'm going to help you. But very important that children sense that you are the one still in charge, because it's very anxiety provoking for a child if they think they're ruling the roost. So it is important for us to make that, to say, you know what, I've changed my mind. I think I am going to help you, or I'm going to get you started.
And you know what, Eva? At the same time, I think the other piece too is some adults are so afraid that if we invite the will of the child for them to be able to name that means that we've lost our authority, and it doesn't mean that at all. You know, for us to make space for it, it doesn't mean that we're going to go along with what they're saying. We're just inviting them to share what's in them.
Yes, instincts are very, very interesting things to work with, but we need to respect them. I'm going. Are there any other questions or comments?
No.
I'm going to tell my favorite Charlie story, my absolute favorite Charlie story, because they were making cookies, and the teacher decided, and some of you might not agree with this, but at that time she felt it was the right thing to do. They were making cookies, and they had cookie dough, and she said to the students, you can stir the cookie dough and then you can taste it. And she gave every one of them a wooden popsicle stick, and quite rightly said, of course, to the children, now please don't break your popsicle sticks. Well, poor Mr. COUNTERWILL, who basically felt that nobody loved him, look, and the teacher told me afterwards, she said to me, he looked me right in the eye, and he went like this. And of course, he had to be sent away because he just did the opposite of what the teacher had asked him to do. And again, I'm sure at that moment when he turned his back, he was looking at the two pieces of, what did I do? What did I do? He lost eating cookie dough because his brain basically said, you can't push me around. And of course, as I say, he had many reasons. You know, he had a mom and a dad who just couldn't be there for him. So, you know, poor little Charlie, you know, how could we come alongside? And of course, she learned afterwards to say things like, not to tell him what not to do, but just, well, you know, we need to be careful with our part, whatever. But anyway, poor little Charlie. Yep. But we got him out of it. He eventually, a couple of years we worked with him, and he started then to soften with us and let us, you know, allowed us to guide him as best we could. So, yes. Well, we are just about at our time. I just want to remind everyone that we have one more session next week. It will be Martine who will be leading us this time, the child who acts aggressively. So please read chapter 14. And if you do have questions, you can either email them to me or email them to Martine. You have both of our email addresses, but mine I put in the email, so please email them to me. And we look forward to seeing you in a week's time. Hang in there. We're so pleased that so many of you could join us.
Have a great week.